The autumn rain fell in sheets across 135th Street, turning the Harlem pavement into a mirror that reflected the neon signs of corner stores and jazz clubs. Inside a modest brownstone apartment, far from the glamorous speakeasies and rowdy numbers joints that define the neighborhood's nightlife, Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson sat at a worn mahogany desk reading. Not the racing forms or street reports his associates might have expected, but Marcus Aurelius. The Meditations lay open before him, its pages marked with careful annotations in the margins. This was the Bumpy Johnson that history often overlooked, the intellectual, the strategist, the man who understood that true power in Harlem required something far more sophisticated than muscle and intimidation. The year was 1952, and Bumpy had recently returned from a stint in Alcatraz, where he'd spent his time not plotting revenge or nursing grievances, but studying. Philosophy, political science, economics, history. He devoured books the way other men consumed whiskey. His cell had been a university, and he'd emerged with a degree in understanding power that no institution could have granted. When old friends asked what he'd learned on the Rock, he'd smile that knowing smile and say, "I learned that fear is temporary, but respect is forever, and respect comes from thinking 3 moves ahead." Harlem in the early 50s existed in a strange liminal space, still vibrant with the residual energy of the Renaissance that had put it on the cultural map, yet increasingly under siege from forces both external and internal. The Mafia families downtown were eyeing the lucrative numbers rackets with undisguised hunger. The police department, corrupt but predictable under Tammany Hall's influence, was becoming more erratic as reform movements gained steam. And the community itself was changing, with new migrations bringing different dynamics, different needs, different dreams. Most men in Bumpy's position would have approached this landscape with simple tools: violence to maintain territory, bribes to maintain protection, intimidation to maintain order. But Bumpy Johnson had never been most men. He saw Harlem not as a territory control, but as an ecosystem to understand. And understanding meant seeing the invisible threads that connected everything: the political machine to the church basement, the numbers runner to the welfare office, the jazz club to the real estate office planning urban renewal. His first move upon returning was characteristically unexpected. Instead of immediately reasserting his dominance through traditional displays of force, he spent 3 months simply observing. He took long walks through every neighborhood in Harlem, from Sugar Hill where the black elite lived in elegant brownstones, to the rougher blocks east of 8th Avenue, where poverty left its mark in broken windows and broken spirits. He listened to the street corner philosophers debate Malcolm X's fiery new rhetoric. He sat in on rent strikes organized by tenant associations. He attended church services and community board meetings. He watched and listened and thought. What he observed troubled him more than any threat from rival gangsters ever could. Harlem was being hollowed out not by bullets but by policy. Urban renewal projects, cynically called Negro removal by those who understood their true purpose, were being planned in city offices downtown. The Federal Housing Administration was systematically denying mortgages to black families, a practice that would later be called redlining. Banks were refusing business loans to Harlem entrepreneurs, while readily financing white-owned businesses in other boroughs. The neighborhood's economic foundation was being deliberately undermined, and most people were too focused on daily survival to see the larger game being played. Bumpy understood something fundamental that would only be articulated years later by more celebrated strategists: that real power isn't about controlling people through force, but about controlling conditions within which people make choices. The Mafia could take over numbers rackets through violence, but that would only make them occupiers, resented and vulnerable. The police could raid establishments and make arrests, but that was treating symptoms, not causes. The real game was being played at a different level entirely, in zoning boards, in bank boardrooms, in city planning offices, and political backrooms. So Bumpy began building something unprecedented. Not a criminal empire in the traditional sense, but an alternative power structure that could operate in the spaces where official institutions failed Harlem's residents. He started with information. In an era before computers or sophisticated intelligence networks, Bumpy created one of the most effective information-gathering operations in New York City. He recruited barbers and beauticians, whose chairs became confessionals where people shared their troubles. He cultivated relationships with janitors in City Hall and courthouses who could access documents others never knew existed. He befriended secretaries and filing clerks, the invisible workers who actually made institutions function. The intelligence network served multiple purposes. It allowed Bumpy to know about police raids before they happened, certainly, but more importantly, it gave him a comprehensive understanding of what was actually happening in his community. When Mrs. Henderson on 126th Street was being harassed by her landlord, Bumpy knew about it. When the city was planning to condemn buildings for a new highway project, Bumpy knew about it. When a promising young student couldn't afford college tuition, Bumpy knew about it. Information was power, but Bumpy understood that information and use was worthless. It had to be acted upon strategically. His approach to the Italian Mafia families demonstrates his sophistication. While other Harlem operators either fought hopeless wars against the mob or capitulated entirely, Bumpy played a longer game. He recognized that the Mafia needed local legitimacy and local knowledge to operate effectively in Harlem. They could muscle their way in, but they couldn't sustain control without understanding the neighborhood's unique dynamics. Bumpy positioned himself as an essential intermediary, not as a subordinate, but as a partner who brought something they couldn't acquire through force. In negotiations with the Genovese family, Bumpy demonstrated a masterful understanding of leverage that had nothing to do with violence. He had mapped every numbers operation, every policy bank, every location where illegal gambling occurred. But more than that, he understood the social infrastructure that made these operations possible. He knew which community leaders looked the other way, which police officers were on the take, which politicians needed the political support that came from not cracking down too hard on activities the community tolerated. The Italians could eliminate Bumpy, certainly, but they'd be left trying to navigate a landscape they didn't understand, alienating community that could make their operations impossible through non-cooperation. The deal Bumpy struck became legendary in underworld circles. The Italians would get a percentage of the numbers' revenue, but Bumpy would maintain operational control in Harlem. More importantly, Bumpy secured something that would prove far more valuable: a degree of political protection. The Mafia families had deep connections to Tammany Hall and city government. Bumpy leveraged those connections not primarily for criminal enterprise protection, but for community benefit. When city inspectors suddenly started harassing Harlem businesses over minor violations, Bumpy could make a call. When a housing project proposal threatened to displace hundreds of families, Bumpy had channels to influence the decision. This was Bumpy's genius. He understood that in a system rigged against his community, criminal connections could sometimes achieve what legitimate protests could not. It was a morally complex position, one that would trouble later scholars who tried to evaluate his legacy. He was undeniably a criminal, profiting from gambling and other illegal activities. Yet he used those profits and connections in ways that sometimes served the community better than the legitimate institutions that were supposed to serve it. Consider his approach to education. Bumpy had never forgotten his own scattered schooling, the way poverty and circumstance had disrupted his formal learning. He was largely self-educated, and he believed fiercely in education as the path to genuine liberation. But he also understood that the public school system in Harlem was systematically underfunded and neglected. So he created an informal scholarship fund, quietly paying tuition for promising students to attend better schools. He funded after-school programs that kept kids off the streets. He hired tutors for children struggling in overcrowded classrooms. The scholarships came with strings attached, though bumpy strings. Recipients were expected to return to Harlem after graduation to use their education to strengthen the community. Some became teachers and doctors and lawyers who served Harlem residents. Others went into business, creating the economic opportunities that legitimate institutions denied. Still others entered politics, eventually becoming part of the civil rights movement that would transform American society. Bumpy never took public credit for these investments, but he kept meticulous records of every student he supported, tracking their progress with the same attention he gave to his business operations. His relationship with the church was similarly nuanced. Bumpy understood that in black communities, the church wasn't just a religious institution, but a political and social organization with enormous influence. Many ministers condemned him publicly, delivering thunderous sermons against the number's rackets and criminal activities. Privately, though, relationships were more complex. Bumpy made substantial donations to church building funds, to programs that fed hungry families, to initiatives that helped people in crisis. He never asked ministers to endorse his activities, but he did ask them to acknowledge the reality that in a community starved of resources, sometimes help came from unexpected sources. Some ministers refused any association with him, and Bumpy respected that. Others found ways to accept the support while maintaining their moral authority. One prominent pastor allegedly told Bumpy, "I will pray for your soul and condemn your sins from the pulpit, but I will also feed the hungry with the resources you provide, because those children didn't choose their benefactor, and they shouldn't starve because of my pride." It was a complicated moral calculus, the kind of ethical tightrope that people living in more privileged circumstances rarely had to walk. Bumpy's strategic thinking extended to his understanding of violence. Unlike the Hollywood depiction of gangsters who killed casually and ruled through fear, Bumpy viewed violence as a tool to be used sparingly and strategically. Every act of violence had consequences that rippled outward. Police attention, community fear, potential retaliation, disruption of business operations. The costs often outweighed the benefits. Better to resolve disputes through negotiation, through finding mutual interests, through demonstrating that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. This didn't mean Bumpy was soft or unwilling to use force when necessary. His reputation for fierce loyalty to his people and swift retribution against those who violated certain codes was well earned. But the violence was calculated, purposeful, designed to send specific messages and establish clear boundaries. When a rival operator began preying on small-time numbers runners, forcing them to work for starvation wages, Bumpy didn't immediately retaliate with gunfire. Instead, he systematically undermined the rival's operations, offering better terms of runners, cutting off his supply lines, alerting police to locations. Only when the rival escalated by attacking one of Bumpy's people did Bumpy respond with force, and then decisively enough that the point was made permanently. His approach to police corruption revealed another dimension of his strategic thinking. Corruption was endemic in the NYPD of that era, and most criminals simply paid their protection money and hoped the cops stayed bought. Bumpy went deeper. He studied individual officers, understanding their motivations, their vulnerabilities, their ambitions. Some were motivated purely by greed. Those were actually the most reliable because their loyalty could be bought and maintained through regular payments. Others were more complicated, officers who saw themselves as pragmatists, willing to look the other way on victimless crimes like gambling, while cracking down on violence and drugs. Bumpy cultivated different relationships with different officers. With the purely corrupt, he maintained business relationships based on clear terms and reliable payments. With the pragmatists, he positioned himself as a stabilizing force in Harlem, someone who kept the truly dangerous elements in check. He would provide information about violent criminals or drug dealers, helping these officers make arrests that advanced their careers while eliminating people who were bad for business and worse for the community. With the rare honest cop, he maintained a respectful distance, never attempting to corrupt them, but also ensuring they understood that he wasn't their primary problem in a neighborhood with plenty of actual violent crime to address. This sophisticated approach to law enforcement relationships meant that Bumpy rarely faced serious prosecution despite his high profile. Police knew who he was and what he did, but building a case against him was consistently difficult. His operations were compartmentalized and carefully structured. He rarely handled money or contraband directly. Most importantly, he had created enough goodwill in the community and enough useful relationships with police that no one was particularly motivated to dedicate the resources necessary to bring him down. The FBI was a different matter. Edgar Hoover's obsession with monitoring black leadership, particularly anyone he perceived as having influence in black communities, meant Bumpy attracted federal attention. FBI files on Bumpy Johnson eventually ran to thousands of pages, documenting his movements, his associations, his businesses. But even federal surveillance revealed the complexity of his position in Harlem. Agents noted with frustration that he was simultaneously a criminal and a community benefactor, that people protected him not just from fear, but from a genuine belief that he provided for the neighborhood in ways the government did not. One FBI report from 1960 captured this contradiction perfectly. Subject continues to operate numbers rackets and other illegal enterprises. However, investigation complicated by Subject's popularity in Negro community. Subject known to provide financial assistance to families in need, to support various community programs, and to intercede with landlords and businesses on behalf of residents. Many community members appear to view Subject as more responsive to their needs than legitimate authorities. Bumpy's relationship with the emerging civil rights movement was characteristically complex. He was not a public activist. His criminal record and activities made that impossible, but he provided crucial support behind the scenes. When organizers needed money for bail funds, Bumpy contributed. When protesters needed meeting spaces, Bumpy made buildings available. When activists faced threats from white supremacist groups, Bumpy provided protection. He understood that the movement was fighting for the same community he served, just through different means. Malcolm X, during his years in Harlem, had a particularly interesting relationship with Bumpy. Both men were intellectuals who had educated themselves through reading and observation. Both understood power and how it operated in racialized America. Malcolm publicly condemned the numbers rackets and criminal activity, but he also recognized that Bumpy commanded respect in the community and used his influence in ways that sometimes aligned with the Nation of Islam's interests. They maintained a careful mutual respect, each acknowledging the other's role in Harlem's complex ecosystem without endorsing each other's methods. Bumpy's strategic thinking extended to economic development in ways that prefigured later approaches to community empowerment. He recognized that Harlem's fundamental problem was capital flight. Money came into the neighborhood, but immediately flowed out to white-owned businesses, banks, and landlords. The community needed a way to capture and circulate wealth internally. Bumpy couldn't solve this problem single-handedly, but he could influence it at the margins. He invested in black-owned businesses, providing capital that banks wouldn't. A restaurant here, a dry cleaner there, a small manufacturing operation, a taxi service. These weren't always profitable investments from a purely financial perspective, but Bumpy evaluated them using a different calculus. A business that employed 20 Harlem residents and kept money circulating in the community had value beyond its profit margin. He positioned himself as a development bank for entrepreneurs who couldn't access legitimate financing, taking equity stakes in businesses he thought could succeed with adequate capital and mentorship. His mentorship was often as valuable as his money. Bumpy had learned business by running complex illegal operations that required logistics, accounting, personnel management, risk assessment, and strategic planning. He shared this knowledge generously with entrepreneurs he supported, teaching them how to manage cash flow, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to navigate city bureaucracy, how to handle difficult personnel situations. Some of the businesses he supported went on to become Harlem institutions, anchoring neighborhoods economically for decades. Real estate was another area where Bumpy thought strategically about community control. He observed that urban renewal was essentially a land grab, displacing black residents from increasingly valuable property. The solution wasn't just to fight displacement, but to secure ownership. Bumpy quietly bought properties throughout Harlem, sometimes in his own name, more often through intermediaries and shell companies. Some properties housed as illegal operations, certainly, but others were simply held as long-term investments and community assets. He became a landlord, and by all accounts a better one than most in Harlem. Rents were reasonable, maintenance was actually performed, evictions were rare, and used only as a last resort. In an era when many Harlem landlords were absentee owners who extracted maximum rent while letting buildings deteriorate, Bumpy's property stood out. Again, this wasn't purely altruistic. Stable tenants who paid rent reliably were better for business than the revolving door of evictions and vacancies. But the effect was to provide housing security for families who might otherwise have been vulnerable to displacement. His understanding of political power was perhaps most sophisticated in his approach to patronage and reciprocity. Bumpy recognized that Harlem had votes, and votes had value in New York's political machine. But the community's voting power was diffused and often poorly organized. He worked to consolidate and direct it, creating informal political networks that could deliver votes in exchange for tangible benefits. This wasn't the kind of crude vote buying that characterized some machine politics. Instead, Bumpy helped organize community leaders, church officials, and block captains who could mobilize voters around specific candidates and issues. The candidates who received the support understood that they had obligations in return, not to Bumpy personally, but to the community. They needed to deliver on jobs, on city services, on protecting Harlem's interests in City Hall. Those who delivered continued to receive support. Those who took Harlem's votes for granted found that support evaporating. Through this political organizing, Bumpy exercised influence over decisions that affected Harlem's future. Highway routing, public housing location, school funding, police deployment. These seemingly technical decisions were actually political choices that profoundly impacted the community. By mobilizing voting blocks and maintaining relationships with politicians who needed those votes, Bumpy created leverage to influence these choices in ways that benefited Harlem residents. His mentorship of younger people involved in the streets revealed another dimension of his strategic thinking. When young men came to him wanting to get involved in his operations, Bumpy's response often surprised them. He would ask about their education, their skills, their legitimate opportunities. If they showed any aptitude for legal work, he would discourage them from criminal activity and sometimes actively help them find legitimate employment or educational opportunities. The streets, he would tell them, were for people who had no other options, and even then, they were a trap that most would never escape. For those who persisted, who seemed determined to pursue criminal activity regardless, Bumpy would teach them the craft properly, not the Hollywood version of gangster life, but the reality. The importance of discipline, of keeping your word, of avoiding unnecessary violence, of thinking long-term rather than grabbing quick money. He emphasized the business aspects, teaching them to understand profit margins and risk assessment. Most importantly, he tried to impress upon them that criminal enterprise in a community like Harlem came with responsibilities. You couldn't just extract wealth and leave the neighborhood worse than you found it. As the 1960s progressed and Bumpy aged, he watched Harlem changing in ways that both gratified and troubled him. The civil rights movement was achieving victories he'd never thought possible in his lifetime. Segregation was crumbling legally, even if social reality lagged behind. Black political power was growing, with more representatives actually serving their constituents rather than just extracting from them. The community activism he'd quietly supported was becoming more organized and effective. But he also saw darker trends. Heroin was flooding into Harlem, creating an addiction crisis that was destroying families and communities. This wasn't like a numbers rackets or even illegal gambling he'd overseen. This was poison, pure and simple, and Bumpy wanted no part of it. He used his influence to oppose drug dealing in areas he controlled, even as this created conflicts with younger criminals who saw drugs as easy money and didn't share his qualms. The introduction of heroin into Harlem was not a random market development, but a deliberate choice by some criminal organizations, and Bumpy suspected darker forces at work. In his more paranoid moments, though perhaps paranoia was justified given what would later be revealed about COINTELPRO and other government operations targeting black communities, he wondered whether the drug epidemic was being deliberately facilitated to undermine the growing Black Power movement. Drugs incapacitated potential activists, justified aggressive policing, and discredited communities in the eyes of the broader public. Whether or not his suspicions were correct, Bumpy fought a losing battle against the drug trade in his final years. Younger criminals didn't share his sense of community responsibility or his long-term strategic thinking. They saw only immediate profits and didn't care about the destruction drugs caused. The organizational structures Bumpy had built, based on personal relationships and shared values, were breaking down as a new generation with different values entered the streets. His last years were spent trying to preserve what he'd built, while acknowledging that time and change were inexorable. He continued supporting education initiatives, continued investing in black-owned businesses, continued trying to mentor young people toward better paths. But he was increasingly an artifact of a different era, when criminal activity in Harlem operated according to certain codes and served certain community functions, however problematic that reality was. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, the outpouring of grief in Harlem surprised observers unfamiliar with his complex role in the community. Thousands attended his funeral, Not just criminals and associates, but teachers and students he'd supported, business owners he'd helped, families he'd assisted through crises, activists he'd funded. Eulogies from ministers acknowledged the contradiction he embodied: a criminal who had served his community, a vice purveyor who had educated children, a violent man who had prevented more violence than he caused. His legacy defies simple categorization. He was undeniably a criminal who profited from illegal activities and occasionally used violence. In any fair accounting, these facts cannot be ignored or romanticized. But he was also a strategist who understood power and used it with sophistication, a community leader who provided support when legitimate institutions failed, an intellectual who thought deeply about the structural forces oppressing his community and found ways to resist them within the constraints he faced. The playbook Bumpy Johnson developed, combining information gathering, strategic relationship building, political organizing, economic development, and careful use of force, demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that transcended the criminal context in which he operated. His understanding that real power comes from controlling conditions rather than controlling people, that sustainable influence requires providing genuine value, that short-term thinking inevitably leads to long-term failure. These insights apply far beyond the streets of Harlem. Perhaps the most important lesson from Bumpy's life is about the complexity of moral choices in unjust systems. When legitimate institutions fail a community, when legal pathways to dignity and security are systematically blocked, people find other ways to survive and thrive. Bumpy Johnson found his way in the shadows, building power structures that existed in the spaces where official institutions wouldn't go. His methods were often illegal and sometimes violent, yet they sometimes served community needs that legal institutions ignored. This doesn't justify criminality or romanticize gangster life, but it does demand that we think more carefully about why communities sometimes extend respect to figures operating outside the law, and what that reveals about the failures of legal institutions. Bumpy Johnson's success in Harlem reflected not just his personal qualities, though his intelligence and strategic thinking were exceptional, but also the vacuum created by a society that denied basic opportunities and dignity to Black Americans. In the end, Bumpy Johnson was a master strategist who played the long game in circumstances that encouraged short-term thinking, who thought systematically about power and context that encouraged brute force, who invested in his community when extraction would have been easier and more immediately profitable. His unseen playbook, the careful observation, the cultivation of information networks, the strategic relationship building, the economic thinking, the political organizing, represented a sophisticated approach to power that transcended its criminal context. History has largely forgotten or misunderstood this aspect of who he was, preferring the simpler narrative of the Harlem gangster. But those who knew him, who benefited from his protection or his generosity or his strategic interventions, remembered a more complex figure, the man who read Marcus Aurelius in prison and thought 3 moves ahead even when playing a game rigged against him from the start.